1970s, like I said, I also talk about the singer-songwriter genre. If you study music history and you go back far enough, the singer-songwriter and soft rock kind of, we'll kind of combine those two together. These genres really didn't exist much in the 1960s. It's not until the early 70s, especially as far as chart play and radio play. And musical historians really chalk it up to these two songs. Back to back, these two songs come out in 1970, and they do very well, they chart very high, and they really kind of introduce America to this genre of kind of chill, sing-along. And for us as DJs, it can be, there's a lot of artists in this singer-songwriter era, and think about how we utilize this music. Great for cocktail hour, great for dinner, and some of it even during the event. I mean, you can play some sing-along stuff. Neil Diamond, I just finished my wedding Saturday night with Sweet Caroline. So there's a lot to draw from, and that's why we talk about it in music history, and that's why it's important. Let's talk about 70s classic rock, okay? I don't teach a lot of 70s classic rock, but that's not because I don't like it. I love the genre. If you look at my personal playlist on my iPhone from when I'm running, there's probably 70s classic rock is probably represented right underneath Prince. Like it's probably Prince and then 70s classic rock, you know what I mean? So I love the genre. I'm not knocking the genre, but there's not a lot of 70s rock that we can play at our events, right? It's just not. I mean, you can pick a song here, you can pick a song there, but there's really not. We can certainly play stuff from this album. And I think this album is worth talking about because it's one of those albums that took forever, not to produce, but to find a record label for. If you've ever seen the behind the music or read anything about, I read Meatloaf's autobiography a couple years ago, some very interesting background stories. So that's Meatloaf and that's Jim Steinman. Jim Steinman is a songwriter. He's a producer. He writes music, okay? It has to be very frustrating for somebody like Jim Steinman who can hear a song in his head, but he can't produce it. He can't sing it, okay? So in the early 70s, he's involved in musical theater, and he meets Meatloaf, okay? And he instantly hears that voice. He knows this is the guy whose voice sounds like what I'm hearing in my head. I can't do it myself. And so they form this basically collaborative, creative partnership where Steinman starts writing songs specifically for Meatloaf, okay? And they put this entire album together. And then instead of making demos, because they feel like they're so much better live, they make appointments with record executives and go face to face into their office. Steinman brings his piano or his little keyboard and he plays and Meatloaf sings. Can you imagine these record executives who had that opportunity to hear Meatloaf and Jim Steinman one-on-one singing these songs, and yet they were universally rejected? Famously, Clive Davis, they somehow got a meeting with Clive Davis, who's, let's face it, one of the most famous producers and record label owners, and Clive Davis throws them out of his office. This is the quote that Meatloaf said in his autobiography, that Clive Davis was screaming at Jim Steinman, do you know how to write a song? Do you know anything about writing? Have you ever listened to pop music? Have you ever heard any rock and roll music? You should go downstairs, leave here, and buy some rock and roll records. That was Clive Davis's reaction, okay? So Meatloaf and Jim Steinman are so ready to just give up on this project. They're never gonna get sold. But there was one musician who heard it and believed in it and said, I wanna help you make this record. Anybody know? Todd Rundgren. Todd Rundgren heard them and said, he literally said, I've got to do this album. It's so out there. And that's why they couldn't get it produced, because it was so out there. It didn't sound like anything on radio, right? So Todd Rundgren spearheads the production of Bat Out of Hell. He brings in the musicians. Some people say that they hear similarities from Bat Out of Hell to Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen's. I personally don't hear that, but if you do hear it, it's because Roy Bittan, I think it's pronounced, and Max Weinberg, two members of the E Street Band, play on this album, okay? Edgar Winter plays saxophone on the album. Todd Rundgren does a lot of the guitar work, and I'm gonna play for you one of the most amazing moments on this record. When they were working on the title track, Bat Out of Hell, Jim Steinman said, I need a motorcycle. The song is about a kid who rides a motorcycle, goes off the road, right? He goes, I need a motorcycle. They listened to some of the tapes that they had of motorcycle sounds, and he was just, it's not right, it's not right, it's not right. Todd Rundgren says, I can play that. So what you're about to hear, if you've always thought this was a motorcycle, it's not. It's Todd Rundgren playing this on his guitar. An amazing moment, I think, in music.
to you.
Todd Rundgren on guitar. I want to hear that at the next trend. The other story that I love from Meatloaf's autobiography, you know, Phil Rizzuto participates in Paradise by the Dashboard Lights. Everybody knows that. And I had always heard that Phil Rizzuto was duped into going to the studio because, you know, if you're not familiar with it, you should be. He basically does a play-by-play, but it's, you know, it's an analogy or it's a hidden double entendre to a guy getting the first base and second base and third base and eventually does he score or not. So when the album becomes big, I had always heard that Phil Rizzuto said, I didn't know what I was getting into. I went into the studio, they gave me a script, I read it. Meatloaf says no, that Phil Rizzuto was not only in on it, they had a woman moaning in the studio to get him more into it. It wasn't until the album becomes huge, and he's Catholic, he's an Italian Catholic, and his pastor said, Phil, how could you do that? That's when he started denying having any knowledge about it. So I love that. So how does Bat Outta Hell do after being rejected by so many record industry executives? It's only the 5th highest selling album of all time. Only, right? Only the 5th highest selling. And 43 million sold. It's 43 million units sold. It's amazing.